Would love Caitlin to do is get up one time and then just slap the out of her.
At the whole situation, Caitlin Clark getting punched in the throat, the suspension, media backlash.
It's got to stop. It is deliberate. It's intentional. She's wearing a target on her back. She's not gay. She's not black.
So you'd say 100% there is a racial element behind this, and there's a sexuality aspect to this because she's white, straight, and from rural America.
She's the golden goose of the WNBA, and people are jealous.
And she laughed. I knew she laughed. She's laughing about assaulting Lexie Hull.
Less than 3 weeks. That is all the time it took for Alyssa Thomas to go from punching Caitlin Clark in the throat on national television to driving her elbow directly into Lexie Hull's nose in front of an entire arena. Same player, same target, different victim. And the WNBA, the league that spent 2 full weeks releasing statements about player safety and promising the world that things would change, watched it happen again, and did absolutely nothing in real time. Hull sat on the bench holding a towel to her bloody face. The video was already spreading across every platform before the quarter even ended. 72,000 views in hours, and not a single flag thrown on the floor. Not a single official stopped play. Not a single league response came through in real time. This is not a story about one hard foul. This is not a story about the physicality of professional basketball. This is a story about a pattern that has become impossible to ignore, a league that keeps choosing silence over accountability, and a locker room that has finally decided it is done waiting for the adults in the room to do something about it. Here is everything that actually happened, and everything the league does not want you to put together. To understand why July 9th hit so differently than anything that had come before it, you have to understand exactly what the Indiana Fever were walking into that night in Phoenix. This was not a standard road game. This was not a neutral stakes mid-season matchup where both teams had room to breathe. This was the second night of a back-to-back, coming off a 106-92 loss to the Lowe's Angels Sparks the night before, and the Fever were arriving in Phoenix with a roster that looked like it had been assembled out of spare parts and sheer determination. Caitlin Clark was not in the lineup. She was resting. Her back was still recovering from what had happened to her 15 days earlier, an incident we will get into in full detail, and the decision was made to keep her out rather than risk further damage on a night when the team was already running on empty. She was in street clothes. She would end up in the tunnel before tip-off signing autographs for fans who had traveled to Phoenix specifically to watch a game she was not going to play in. Sophie Cunningham, the team's emotional engine and the player who had been most vocal about the targeting of her teammates, was listed as questionable with back spasms that had locked up on her the previous day during warm-ups. She had gotten off the ground from stretching, her back seized, and she spent the night before the Phoenix game managing it as best she could. The Fever were shorthanded in ways that went beyond just the box score. And somehow, none of that showed up in the first quarter. Indiana came out blazing in a way that made absolutely no sense given everything surrounding them. Kelsey Mitchell knocked down a 3, Ty Harris hit another. Lexie Hull, the same Lexie Hull who would later be sitting on the bench with a towel pressed to her bloody nose, drained her own 3 as part of a 9-0 run that gave Indiana a 12-5 lead after the first quarter. On the road. On the second night of a back-to-back, without their best player. Against a Phoenix team that had every home advantage and every motivation to win the season series. For one quarter, the Fever looked like a championship-caliber team that had somehow found a reserve tank nobody knew they had. Then the second quarter happened, and Phoenix remembered exactly where they were. Kalani Browncopper caught fire and dropped 10 of her 12 total points in that single period. The Mercury shot 8 of 14 from 3 in the first half alone, a clip that is almost insulting when you consider Indiana was playing their second game in 2 nights without Caitlin Clark. Phoenix outscored Indiana 29-19 in the second quarter and walked into halftime with a 6-point lead. 3 Mercury players had already hit double digits at the break. That 12-point Fever advantage that had felt so significant after the first quarter had been completely erased. like the scoreboard had been wiped clean and reset in Phoenix's favor. But here is the thing about this Indiana Fever team that their critics have consistently failed to account for. They do not quit. They do not fold when the game gets hard or when the situation looks overwhelming. Even without Clark setting the tone from the floor, even with exhausted legs and a depleted rotation, they stayed in the fight and kept competing. When the third quarter started and Phoenix began extending their lead, Mercury 55, Fever 49, double digits, the crowd growing louder, Stephanie White called a timeout, gathered her team, and what followed was one of the more remarkable sequences of the entire WNBA season. A 13-0 run. Aaliyah Boston hitting a transition three. Mercury turnovers compiling. Indiana taking a 62-59 lead with under 4 minutes left in the third quarter, and eventually carrying a 69-68 lead into the fourth. But right in the middle of that comeback, something happened that should have stopped everything. Something that the referees missed entirely. Something the league would spend the next 24 hours treating as a matter requiring careful review when the video made it clear within seconds that it required immediate action. Alyssa Thomas threw her elbow directly into Lexie Hull's nose, and not one official on the floor did a single thing about it. Hull went to the bench, towel to her face. Blood. The game kept going like a player had not just taken an elbow to the nose from an opponent who had already been suspended once in the past 15 days for a non-basketball act against a different member of the same team. The stakes of this game extended well beyond the final score. Phoenix was fighting for playoff positioning. Indiana was proving something about the depth and resilience of a roster that critics had spent weeks framing as entirely dependent on one player. The Fever were winning a game they had no business winning by conventional logic, road team, back-to-back, no Clark, compromised Cunningham, and in the middle of all of it, one of their players was on the bench holding a towel to a face that had just been introduced to Alyssa Thomas's elbow. The tension in that building, the stakes attached to that game, and the raw emotion of what was unfolding on that floor made what happened to Hull even more jarring. Because it happened in a game that already had everything on the line, and the officiating crew still saw nothing worth addressing. What happened in Phoenix on July 9th was not an isolated event that can be understood on its own terms. It was the latest chapter in a story that had been building for weeks, one that involved the same player, the same team being targeted, the same league failing to respond with consequences that meant anything. To understand why July 9th hit the sports world the way it did, you have to go back and look at the full picture, because the elbow to Hull's nose was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment the story became impossible to explain away. The clip is 14 seconds long. You do not need context to understand what you are watching. You do not need a slow-motion breakdown, a rules expert, or a frame-by-frame analysis to interpret the content of that footage. You watch it once and you know immediately with complete certainty what that was. Alyssa Thomas, elbow, Lexie Hull's nose, no call, no flag, no official reaching for their whistle. Nothing. Verified journalist Kyle Ingram of @SnapShotkey posted the footage the moment it became available, and the numbers tell you everything about how the public received it. 72,000 views within hours of posting. Not over a day, not over a week. Hours. And the engagement was not split between people debating whether it was a foul or not. It was not the kind of viral moment where half the comments defend the play and the other half condemn it. It was unanimous. People watched the clip, processed what they saw, and reacted with the same unfiltered, unambiguous fury that comes when something happens in plain sight and the institutional response is silence. Hull came off the floor and went directly to the bench. She sat there with a towel pressed to her face, head slightly down, the image of someone managing real physical pain while her team continued to fight on the floor around her. The photograph that circulated alongside the video, Hull on the bench, towel to her nose, the physical reality of what had just happened written clearly across her posture, became the defining visual of the entire night. Not Kelsey Mitchell's 24 points and 6 assists. Not Aaliyah Boston's 17 points and 7 rebounds in a performance that was quietly one of the better individual outings of her season. Not the 13-0 run. Not the comeback from 10 down. The image was Hull on the bench with a towel to her face because a player from the opposing team had elbowed her in the nose and the referees had let it go entirely. The detail that compounded the outrage was that Hull played through it. She sat on that bench, collected herself, dealt with what had just happened to her, and went back out and contributed. She finished the game with 10 points. 10 points after taking an elbow to the nose, with no call and no acknowledgement from the officiating crew that anything had occurred. While the player who hit her posted 18 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists and faced 0 in-game consequences for what she had done to a member of the opposing roster. The fan reaction did not require analysis or editorial framing to understand. The comments were direct and they were consistent. One fan put it plainly: she choked Clark and called it an accident. Now she elbowed Hull in the nose. How many accidents is one player allowed to have? Another went straight at the league. The WNBA handed out a game suspension and a $1,000 fine, and this is the result they got: same player, same team, different victim, no call. A third asked the question that cut through everything else and refused to go away. At what point does the league acknowledge that this is a pattern and not a series of coincidences? And a fourth observation, the one that landed with the most weight when people sat with it. Clark is sitting in the tunnel signing autographs, while Thomas is on the court elbowing her teammates, and Clark is somehow the most professional person connected to this entire situation, while the league keeps allowing the people around her to get hurt. What makes this incident uniquely devastating for the league's credibility is not just the act in isolation. It is the timing. The WNBA had spent 2 full weeks after the Clark incident presenting itself to the public as an organization that took player safety seriously, that had systems in place to identify and respond to dangerous behavior, that was watching. Commissioner Engelbert gave carefully worded responses to media questions. The league pointed to the retroactive flagrant upgrade and the 1-game suspension as proof that accountability existed within the system. And then on July 9th, 15 days later, on a nationally covered broadcast with cameras capturing every angle, Alyssa Thomas drove her elbow into Lexie Hull's nose, and the officiating crew did nothing. If the intended message after June 24th was that the league was watching and the consequences would be real, the message delivered on July 9th was the precise opposite. The punishment had not functioned as a deterrent. It had functioned as a ceiling, the maximum consequence the league was willing to assign, small enough that it communicated more tolerance than accountability. And every player watching Hull sit on that bench with a towel to her face now had to calculate, consciously or not, what the league's actual commitment to protecting them looked like when tested by a second incident involving the same player against the same team. The answer that July 9th provided was not reassuring. And the broader question it raised, whether the WNBA's disciplinary structure is built to protect its players or to protect its own public image, became the defining question of the moment. To fully understand the weight of what happened on July 9th, you have to go back to June 24th and sit with it properly. Not the surface version of the story, not just the foul and the suspension and the fine. The full version. Because what happened that night in the Fever-Mercury game was not just a hard play that crossed a line. It was the moment that set every single thing that followed into motion. The congressional letter, the media firestorm, the fan outrage, Thomas laughing in post-game footage, and the conditions that transformed the Hull elbow from a serious incident into a full-scale crisis. June 24th, Indiana Fever versus Phoenix-Mercury. Alyssa Thomas drives a closed fist directly into Caitlin Clark's throat, not an elbow in a crowd, not incidental contact that could be explained by positioning or the chaos of a play developing in real time. A fist, into Clark's throat, during live play, on national television. The officials reviewed it, saw it clearly enough to upgrade it from the original no call to a flagrant 2, the most serious foul classification in the WNBA rulebook. Thomas was ejected. The league conducted a formal post-game review. And when that review concluded, the punishment that came down was a 1-game suspension and a $1,000 fine. 1 game, $1,000, for a flagrant 2 fist to the throat of the most commercially valuable, most watched, most culturally significant player in the history of the league. The reaction was immediate and it was withering. A $1,000 fine in a league where Clark's presence alone had driven documented spikes in attendance, revenue, television ratings, and sponsorship interest. A $1,000 fine for an act the league's own officials had classified as a non-basketball play. Meaning, it was not incidental contact, not an aggressive defensive move, not physicality that fell within the acceptable range of competitive basketball. The league said with one hand that what Thomas did was outside the bounds of the sport, and with the other hand attached a financial consequence that most professional athletes spend on a post-game meal. Thomas's public response made the entire situation significantly worse. She called the play a complete accident. She said she and her teammates did not even know it happened during the game. She delivered this account with a composure that read, to a significant portion of the public, as dismissive rather than remorseful. She served the one-game suspension. She returned to the lineup. The league issued its statements about player safety and moved forward. Except Clark did not fully move forward. Her back was still in recovery when July 9th arrived, which is why she was in street clothes watching from the tunnel rather than on the floor. The physical consequence of June 24th was still affecting Clark's availability 15 days later, while Thomas was back on the court, on a bad foot, putting up 18 points and throwing elbows into the faces of Clark's teammates. And then there is the footage of Thomas laughing. Post-game video circulated online showing Thomas in what could be read as a light-hearted, dismissive mood when the Clark incident came up in conversation. Not measured, not careful. Not the tone of someone who understood the gravity of what they had done or the institutional weight of a flagrant 2 suspension. The footage did not receive the mainstream coverage it deserved in the immediate aftermath, but the fans who saw it remembered it. They filed it away. And when July 9th happened and Hull was on the bench with a towel to her face, that footage came roaring back into the conversation with completely reframed significance. Because it shifted the entire narrative from accident to attitude, from a player who made a mistake and understood the consequences to a player who did not appear to take either the act or the consequences particularly seriously. The question that June 24th left unanswered, the one that the entire league was watching for, was whether the punishment would function as an actual deterrent, whether a one-game suspension and a $1,000 fine was enough to change behavior going forward. July 9th answered that question definitively and with zero ambiguity. The deterrent had not worked. The behavior had continued. A different player from the same team was now on the bench holding a towel to her nose. And the gap between what the league said it stood for and what actually happened on that floor had grown wide enough that no press release was going to close it. One incident can be framed as an accident. 2 incidents targeting the same team in 15 days demands a fundamentally different conversation. But the full scope of Alyssa Thomas's disciplinary situation heading into July 9th is significantly more layered than the surface coverage of either incident suggested, because it was not just the Clark punch and the Hull elbow sitting in isolation. It was an accumulating record that the league had been watching develop in real time, with multiple data points pointing toward escalation, and an institutional response that had not moved fast enough or decisively enough to get ahead of what was clearly building. Thomas entered July 9th with 4 technical fouls on the season. In the WNBA, reaching 5 technical fouls triggers a mandatory warning letter from the league office, the formal mechanism by which the league acknowledges that a behavioral pattern exists and puts the player on official notice that continued accumulation will carry automatic consequences. Thomas was sitting at 4. 1 technical foul away from that threshold. And she was simultaneously sitting on a flagrant point total that was climbing toward the range where mandatory suspensions kick in automatically, regardless of what the league office decides to do on a case-by-case basis. She was not just approaching 1 warning threshold. She was approaching multiple, simultaneously, in a compressed window of time. The technical foul that pushed her to 4 did not come in some distant earlier part of the season. It came on July 8th, the night before the Hull elbow. The Fever were playing the Chicago Sky, and Thomas picked up the technical during that loss. On the same night, her left foot buckled under her on a non-contact play, her ankle collapsing in a moment that drew immediate concern from sideline observers and raised legitimate questions about her ability to compete at full capacity going forward. She was playing hurt. She was 1 technical away from a mandatory warning. And she had a flagrant 2 suspension on her record from 15 days earlier for a non-basketball act against a player from the exact same team she was scheduled to face the following night. Playing through injury is not a character indictment. Competing on a bad foot when your team needs you is exactly what professional athletes do and are respected for doing. That part of Thomas's situation is not the issue. The issue is the full constellation of circumstances surrounding her when she stepped onto the floor in Phoenix on July 9th. The technical count, the flagrant accumulation, the suspension history, the ankle situation, and the 15-day window since an incident the league had classified as outside the bounds of basketball, and the complete absence of any proactive institutional response to that constellation before she played another minute against the Indiana Fever. The WNBA's disciplinary structure, as it currently operates, is fundamentally reactive. Something happens on the floor, footage gets reviewed, a punishment gets assigned after the fact, a statement gets released about player safety, and the league waits to see what happens next. That system produced the $1,000 fine and 1-game suspension for the Clark incident. It produced no real-time response to the Hull elbow. And at no point between June 24th and July 9th did it produce a proactive intervention. A moment where the league looked at Thomas's accumulating flagrant points, her technical foul count, her suspension history, and the fact that she was scheduled to play against the same team again, and decided to address the situation before something else happened rather than after. Stephen A. Smith said it publicly 2 weeks before July 9th, and the events of that night validated every word of it. The WNBA needs to police this league the way the NBA does, with proactive monitoring, retroactive review applied consistently, meaningful financial penalties, and a disciplinary framework that treats patterns as patterns rather than waiting for each incident to be evaluated in isolation. The NBA watches technical foul accumulation in real time. It applies heightened scrutiny to players who have recently been disciplined for conduct violations. It does not wait for a second incident against the same team to question whether the first punishment was sufficient. The WNBA's structure, as demonstrated across these 15 days, does not function that way. And the Indiana Fever's players experienced that gap directly and repeatedly. The most revealing aspect of the WNBA's handling of this entire sequence of events is not any single decision made in isolation. It is the pattern of decisions, and conspicuous non-decisions, that define the league's institutional response from June 24th through July 9th and beyond. Because when you lay those responses side by side and look at them as a coherent whole rather than individual moments, what emerges is an organization that has consistently and repeatedly prioritized the management of its public image over the genuine structural accountability that its players deserved and its credibility required. After the Clark throat punch, the league did the part that the system is designed to do. It reviewed the footage, identified that the foul had been undercalled in real time, upgraded it to a flagrant 2, and assigned a punishment. That mechanism functioned. The rules worked as written, but the punishment itself, 1 game and $1,000, sent a signal that traveled clearly through every locker room in the league, regardless of how the league framed it publicly. The message was not that the WNBA had drawn a firm line on non-basketball acts of physical aggression. The message was that if you cross that line, the maximum consequence you face is missing 1 game and paying a fine that represents a fraction of what most professional athletes earn in a week. The league needed to be seen as doing something. It did something small. It attached the language of accountability to consequences that did not carry the weight of actual accountability, and then called it resolved. 11 Republican members of Congress decided that was not good enough. Led by U.S. Representative August P. Pfluger of Texas, 11 elected federal officials sent a formal letter to WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. The letter cited what the lawmakers described as physical hostility and violence toward Caitlin Clark specifically. One line in the letter went further than anything the league itself had been willing to say publicly. It referenced reports suggesting that the attacks on Clark may be racially motivated. 11 members of the United States Congress, writing to the commissioner of a professional sports league, about the physical safety of one of its players is not a routine occurrence. It does not happen in the normal course of sports governance. It represents an extraordinary level of external institutional pressure that signals, clearly and without ambiguity, that the conversation has moved far outside the boundaries of sports discourse and into territory that the league cannot manage or redirect through standard public relations responses. Engelbert's public response was, in practical terms, silence. Carefully worded, professionally delivered silence, but silence. Fever coach Stephanie White was asked about the congressional letter directly in a post-game press conference and deflected it with equal professionalism. The team could not control outside groups. They were not affiliated with those organizations. They focused on what they could control. It was a corporate non-answer, delivered carefully, designed to communicate that the franchise was not going to wade into the political dimension of this story, regardless of the pressure being applied from outside. The coaching staff's position was to keep the main thing, and not let external noise become an organizational distraction. The problem with that approach, however understandable it is from a franchise management perspective, is that it left the players entirely alone with what they were experiencing. Clark was in street clothes because of what Thomas had done to her. Hull was on the bench with a towel to her face. The league was releasing press releases about player safety commitments while not responding in real time to an elbow to a nose on a nationally broadcast game. And the institutional response available to the players in that moment was to trust the process and stay professional. The disconnect between what the league publicly said it stood for and what players were actually experiencing on the floor had become so visible that no carefully worded statement was going to close the gap. Lisa Leslie, one of the most credible and measured voices in the history of women's basketball, said publicly that the players, the officials, and the league all needed to do better. She did not target one party. She did not frame it as an attack on the league or on Thomas or on any individual. She acknowledged a collective, systemic failure across every layer of the sport. And that statement landed with particular force precisely because Leslie is not a reactionary commentator, not a partisan voice, not someone who speaks carelessly or for effect. When Lisa Leslie says the league needs to do better, it carries institutional weight that makes it impossible to dismiss as fan outrage or media sensationalism. The league's response to Leslie's comments, and to the broader chorus of credible voices raising the same concern, was consistent with its response to everything else in this sequence, measured, minimal, and insufficient relative to the scale of what had occurred. If the league was not going to respond with the force the moment required, Sophie Cunningham was going to respond in the only way immediately available to her. And she made absolutely certain that everyone in that building understood exactly what she thought of the entire situation. Not in a press conference, not through official channels, not in the carefully managed format that organizations use to filter player communication during moments of institutional tension. She said it on the court, in Phoenix, in front of the crowd that had been riding her all night, pointing directly at the fans who thought the game was going to go the other way, and making sure they understood it had not. The moment came after the Fever had secured the victory. Cunningham had delivered in the clutch, hitting critical free throws in the final minutes, with the Phoenix crowd applying the full force of a hostile road environment to try to get inside her head. Rather than keeping her composure in the manner coaches prefer and walking back to the huddle with the detached professionalism of a player who has heard it all before, Cunningham turned to face the crowd and pointed, directly at them, with full intention. The gesture did not require translation. It said everything she was not going to say into a microphone. "We won. We did it without Clark. Your player elbowed one of our teammates in the face tonight, and we still came into your building and beat you. And I am standing right here so you can feel exactly what that means." The clip spread immediately. Commentators and fans caught it in real time and amplified it across every platform within minutes. But the secondary detail in that footage, the one that actually reveals the most about the internal dynamics of this Indiana Fever organization, was Stephanie White. Watch the clip closely, and you will see White moving toward Cunningham the moment the pointing gesture begins. Get your hand down. The words are visible even if you cannot hear them clearly. The coach moving to manage the moment, to redirect the energy, to preserve the professional image the franchise wants to project in victory. And Cunningham holding the gesture long enough to make her point before complying, the way a player does when they have made the decision that the point is worth making regardless of the instruction coming from the sideline. That friction between Cunningham's instinct to respond and White's instinct to manage the optics is the most human and honest moment in this entire story. It captures with complete clarity the impossible position that the Fever's players have been placed in over the past several weeks. They are watching their teammates get physically targeted. Clark's throat on June 24th, Hull's nose on July 9th, and they are being asked by the organizational structure around them to maintain professionalism, to let the league handle it, to stay focused on basketball, to trust the process. And there is a point at which a player with Cunningham's temperament and Cunningham's convictions reaches the limit of what she is willing to absorb quietly while waiting for someone with more institutional authority to act. Cunningham had already gone on record before July 9th saying that teams were definitely targeting Indiana. She had named it directly when others around the league were still using qualified, careful language. She had been the most consistently vocal Fever player on the subject of physical aggression targeting her teammates, and she had done it at a time when public support for making that claim explicitly was still uncertain enough that it carried real professional risk. When the Hull elbow happened on July 9th, Cunningham was already managing her own back spasms and watching from the bench in a limited capacity. She was dealing with her own physical situation while watching one of her teammates take an elbow to the nose with no call. By the time the final whistle blew and the Fever had secured the win, the pointing celebration was not an impulsive act of poor judgment from a player who let her emotions get ahead of her. It was a player who had been holding something back for weeks, finally releasing it in the one context where she had full permission to compete without apology. What Cunningham's response tells you about the broader locker room is significant and worth sitting with. This is a team that has been physically targeted, has had its best player kept off the floor by an injury sustained in a non-basketball act, has watched the institutional response amount to a $1,000 fine, and still went on the road shorthanded and exhausted and won. The character of that roster is not in question. What is in question, what Cunningham's celebration made undeniable, is that the emotional cost of absorbing all of this while maintaining public professionalism has been real. It has been accumulating, and the Fever's players are not going to carry it indefinitely without eventually making their feelings visible in the moments when competition gives them the space to do so. Here is the part of this story that gets consistently buried under the weight of the incidents themselves. Indiana won. They won on the road, on the second night of a back-to-back, without Caitlin Clark in the lineup, with Lexie Hull nursing a nose injury she sustained from an in-game elbow that drew no call and no real-time response from the officiating crew. They went on a 13-0 run in the third quarter, 13 straight points, fueled by Phoenix turnovers and Aaliyah Boston hitting a transition three that shifted the entire emotional momentum of the game. They took a 62-59 lead with under 4 minutes left in the third. They carried a 69-68 advantage into the fourth. And they held on to win 92-89 in a game that, by every conventional measure of competitive logic, they should not have won. Kelsey Mitchell was extraordinary. 24 points and 6 assists through 3 quarters, the engine of everything Indiana built offensively in the second half, the player who made the shots when the shots mattered most. Aaliyah Boston put up 17 points and 7 rebounds in a performance that was quietly one of the better outings of her season and would have been the dominant storyline of the night in any other context. These were significant individual performances by players doing significant things in a high-stakes game, and they deserve acknowledgement that tends to get swallowed by the larger controversy surrounding the night. And Clark, who was not playing, was in the tunnel before tip-off signing autographs for Indiana Fever fans who had traveled to Phoenix for a game she was not going to play in. She was in street clothes. She was not competing. She was there, visible, accessible to the fans, signing things and taking photos and being exactly who she always is in those moments. Engaged, genuine, without the detachment that would be entirely understandable given the circumstances of her absence. The image of Clark in the tunnel while her team was fighting on the floor without her is one of the quietly powerful visuals of this entire stretch of the season, because it captures something about her that the controversies surrounding her tend to obscure. She is unfailingly professional. She does not make the story about herself in moments when other people might be tempted to do exactly that. She signs autographs and trusts her teammates and lets the situation be what it is while she recovers from what was done to her. The racial dimension of everything surrounding this story is real, and it is complicated, and it cannot be responsibly addressed by reducing it to a single clean narrative. Multiple credible analysts and commentators have noted that Clark, white, straight, from small-town Iowa, entered a league that is approximately 85% black, immediately became its most commercially valuable player, and has been on the receiving end of physical aggression that the league has not addressed with consequences proportionate to the documented pattern. Some commentators have framed this explicitly in terms of racial resentment, jealousy, and institutional bias operating against Clark because of her identity. Others, including voices as credible and respected as Lisa Leslie and Stephen A. Smith, have pushed back meaningfully on reducing the entire situation to race, arguing that the physicality issue and the officiating inconsistency predates Clark's arrival in the league and reflects deeper structural problems that have nothing to do with Clark's racial identity specifically. What is significantly harder to dismiss is the economic reality that sits underneath all of it. Clark's presence in the WNBA has driven a measurable, documented, undeniable surge in attendance, television ratings, and sponsorship revenue across the entire league. Not just for the Fever. For every team that Clark plays against on the road. For the league's television partners. For the sponsorship conversations happening in boardrooms that had not been happening with anything like the same energy before Clark arrived. The rising tide argument is not rhetoric. It is reflected in actual revenue, numbers that the league itself has referenced publicly. The idea that a player this central to the financial foundation the WNBA is trying to build is being physically targeted, while the league responds with a $1,000 fine, is not just a player safety failure. It is a strategic institutional failure of the first order. And the broader question of whether the people running this league fully understand the magnitude of what they are risking every time they fail to respond proportionately to incidents involving Clark and the players around her, is one that the events of July 9th made impossible to set aside. Sophie Cunningham said teams are definitely targeting Indiana. Lisa Leslie said everyone needs to do better. 11 members of Congress wrote to the commissioner. Hull sat on the bench with a towel to her face, and Clark signed autographs in the tunnel while none of it produced a real-time consequence for the player responsible. That is the state of this situation as of July 10th. And the WNBA has a decision to make about what kind of league it wants to be and how much longer it can afford to make that decision slowly. Here is what July 9th actually proved beyond any reasonable dispute. A one-game suspension and a $1,000 fine does not stop a pattern. Retroactive reviews and carefully worded press releases do not protect players on the floor in real time. A team can watch two of its players get physically targeted within 15 days, travel on a back-to-back without their best player, and still find a way to win on the road. And the league will still be catching up to what happened rather than getting ahead of what comes next. Thomas played 18 points on a bad foot and threw an elbow into Hull's nose with no consequence. Clark was in the tunnel. Hull was on the bench with a towel pressed to her face. Cunningham was pointing at a hostile crowd that had spent the night booing her because she refused to be quiet about what was happening to her team. And the WNBA was positioned somewhere between its last press release and its next carefully worded statement, deciding how to frame a situation that its own decisions and non-decisions had helped create and sustain. The question is no longer just whether Thomas receives another suspension. The question is whether this league's disciplinary architecture is actually capable of identifying and responding to a pattern before a third incident occurs rather than after. Whether the people with institutional authority understand that the gap between what the league publicly says about player safety and what players actually experience on that floor is now visible to everyone, the fans, the media, the players themselves, and apparently 11 members of Congress. The only group that still appears to be catching up is the one with the actual power to fix it. Drop it in the comments. What does the WNBA need to do right now to make this stop?